So far we've only looked at openings that have begun with pawn to e4 or pawn to d4. But the last opening we're going to cover here begins with pawn to c4, which is called the English opening. It seeks to control the d5 square, one of the four key central squares. There are three main responses that black usually chooses in response to c4. He can play c5, which lays claim on the d4 square. And this is called the symmetrical variation because it's the same move but in reverse for black. Or he can play e5, influencing the d4 square but from the e file. Or he plays knight to f6, supporting the d5 square and also preventing white from immediately pushing pawn to e4. And then later he may transpose into playing either c5 or e5. Other less common but playable first moves for black include e6 or g6 and even c6. After either c5 or e5, white usually responds with knight to c3, adding more control over the d5 square. When black plays knight to f6, white usually follows up with pawn to d4 because now he's able to do that since he isn't challenged by a pawn on c5 or e5. Now this can transpose into the Nimzo-Indian or Queen's Gambit openings which we looked at earlier. When black plays c5 or e5 in response to c4, one of the main ideas is to play for central space control, as we mentioned earlier, and play can continue with knight to c3, knight to c6, both laying claim to their respective squares, d5 for white, d4 for black, g3 for white, with the intention of bringing the bishop to g2, putting more pressure along the long diagonal along this e4 and d5 square. And black can copycat white and do the same. Bishop g2, bishop g7, knight to f3, knight to f6, completing their development. And white can go for an immediate d4. We can play c takes d, knight takes d, knight takes, and queen takes. Or both sides can try to play on the queen side instead. Let's back up. And white can play a3 and black can copy with a6 with the idea of eventually pushing the pawn to b4. Maybe brings his rook here. And black can have similar ideas. Both sides are trying to combine the influence of their bishops along the long diagonal with their rooks in the hopes of gaining a majority or create some tactics along the queen side. When black plays pawn to e5 instead, let's set up again here. Pawn to c4, pawn to e5. Play can continue with knight to c3, knight to c6, g3, g6, bishop to g2, bishop to g7, knight to f3, d6, which supports the e5 square, and black can play d3 supporting the c4 pawn. The game has taken on a different strategical idea where black is looking to play along the king side because he already has this pawn advanced, and might continue play with an immediate f5, and white will castle, and black will continue by playing the knight here or here, knight to f6, and now rook to b1 with the same idea as before to play along the queen side for white, making use of this bishop on g2 along this long diagonal. White is looking to try and chase this knight away by playing b4 and b5. As you can see, the English opening is very rich positionally and can take on many different characteristics. So let's look at a couple of openings and see how the English opening has played out in actual play. So white opens c4, signaling the English opening, and black responds with e5. As we mentioned earlier, black is seeking claim to the d4 square, and white will try to challenge the d5 square. Knight to c3, putting more pressure on the d5 square, and black immediately challenges the d4 square a second time as well, with the knight to c6. Knight to f3, putting pressure on this pawn and trying to advance the pawn to d4 so he could also challenge that square. But black doesn't let him. So now he's got 3 men on that square. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. And white only has 2. If he tries to push d4 now, he'll lose the pawn. He doesn't have enough defenders on that square. So white tries a3. He's going to try to push the bishop back here with b4. And black ignores that threat and plays d6 to let this bishop out. It's also a defense for this bishop, this dark squared bishop, if white plays b4. And he does. Now he backs off. It's interesting that black is actually allowing, he's not challenging his d5 square at all. His strategy is to simply try and dominate d4. And he plays e3 to try and push to d4. And black prevents that by pinning the knight. White challenges the bishop. Bishop backs off. And now white plays g4, pushing the bishop to g6, but at the expense of opening up his king side if he chooses to castle over there. You can't have it all in chess. For every gain, there is a loss. And now he gets this d4 push in, but at some cost. Black plays a6, keeps the knight out, allows the bishop to pop back here if he wants to. Bishop develops. And black immediately attacks the king side over here. But there's still the question about what black will do with his king, who is still stuck in the center. White castles, and black opens up the white king side, and now his rook is activated. He recaptures. Queen attacks that undefended pawn immediately. It's interesting how black has really been trying to dictate play, and he has, because white was trying to stop all of black's ideas, and he throws the check in. Yeah, this king is stuck here. He slides out. He's not going to castle in this game. He's going to manually just avoid harassment by white's pieces. White hits the bishop here with a pawn, and he backs off. And now he hits the knight. The knight runs, remaneuvering over to the king side. So white really has won the center race in this game. Queen slides in, centralizing and defending this pawn, putting pressure on this pawn. The rook develops to the central file, also a threat against this pawn. Pawn takes, and then there will be 3 attackers on this pawn. 2 defenders. Be 3 if this bishop gets involved. And the bishop slides over for this massive threat on g7, and he defends against that immediately. As soon as this knight moved, this battery would be available to white. The queen remaneuvers. She vacates the square, and as I mentioned earlier, that's what you need to look at. Now the knight can come here and occupy this square. I'm not sure if that's what he's going to do, but That's one idea here. The knight develops, putting two attackers on this pawn. The pawn runs, always one of your options when under attack. And now the queen challenges this undefended queen. Black is trying to remove some of the attackers on the king side here. The queen runs. The knight slides back, attacking this pawn now 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Only 2 defenders. So white captures. Pawn captures. And now the queen attacks that pawn. And the knight blocks that attack. Queen captures. Knight captures. Defending the pawn. Getting closer into enemy territory, putting pressure on the king side over here. The knight does slide into d4 in preparation for hitting the king here. That would be a fork, winning the rook with check. King slides up to prevent the check. Knight gets in. Rook slides over, x-raying the king here. 1, 2, 3 pieces in its way, but still a very powerful threat. And now black has 4 men bearing down on the king side, and only 1 defender, the bishop. White has to be very careful. He takes this pawn. The knight remaneuvers, removing one of the men, blocking the rook's power to expose this x-ray. Preparing a check here, perhaps, after this bishop moves. Pawn takes, attacking the knight. The knight backs off, attacking the pawn. The pawn moves, attacking the knight. Wow, and black throws in a check, offering the knight to expose this x-ray. But can he take it? Is the question. The king runs. Evidently not. Maybe we'll go back later and look and see why he couldn't take that. Whoa, and the bishop checks. The rook blocks. Oh, a sacrifice. And game over. This is a check, and it's checkmate. The king can't run. If the bishop takes, the rook slides in here with checkmate. Devastating attack that white overlooked. This is a great finish, and white is a top 10 player, by the way. Let's back up and see why white couldn't take that knight right away. There must be another checkmate in there. Okay, so knight checks. Bishop takes. Where shall we move this bishop for devastating effect? We could slide here with check, which prevents the king from running here. Then the bishop could run back and block. Aha. Check. King runs. Bishop takes bishop. And now the king can't escape here. We have a check here in one move. And I guess that would be checkmate. You see, the rook could run and then check, yeah, along the back rank. So that's why he couldn't take that right away, but the other mate was devastating. So there was no solution to the knight sliding in with check. Great attack.